Hello history fans, and welcome to the podcast that helps you learn a little bit of history. Maybe that will be our catchphrase. Maybe. Today we are talking about I am talking about another woman from history who I really admire, and I'll give you 3 guesses. Firstly, she was the chief mourner at Catherine Parr's funeral at just 12 years old. She was the granddaughter of Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister and Queen of France. And thirdly, the painting of her execution is arguably one of the most famous and heartbreaking in art history. That is definitely very arguable. It's a very famous painting. It is, of course, Queen or Lady Jane Grey. And yes, she should be called Queen, and the amount of Tudor or just general monarch history books that don't include her is incredibly sad. So this is her story, and I'll try to keep it in a timeline. Jane is born in 1536. The exact date is unknown, sadly, but she's the oldest of 3 girls. Her father, Henry Grey, is the 3rd Marquess of Dorset and was an academic or intellect. Her mother, Lady Frances Brandon, was the daughter of Henry VIII's sister Mary, so her mother is where her royal lineage comes from. She's born near Leicester and is well educated to fit her status, learning religious reform and Protestantism. It's said that she enjoyed her education and could speak 8 languages. We know of her education and enthusiasm as, unusually in a time where women aren't really included in historians' narratives, people wrote about her intelligence and academic ability. Even her tutor, Robert Ascham, wrote of her scholarly abilities, and he was also Elizabeth I's tutor, who's another woman known for her brains, and he said that Jane was the smarter of the 2. Of course, we're not pitting those 2 women against each other. I'm just trying to show you how known she was for her intelligence. In February of 1547, King Edward's uncle Thomas Seymour bought Jane's wardship, as he recognised her importance as being equal to Mary and Elizabeth. So she leaves Bradgate Park, her family home, and lives at Seymour Place in London. Thomas then marries Catherine Parr, so she spends a lot of time with her, which is great, as she would have had a brilliant impact on Jane as an advocate for religious reform and women's education. At 12 years old, though, she is sadly the chief mourner at Catherine's funeral and goes home to her parents, and then Thomas is executed for high treason in March of 1549 as he conspired to marry the Princess Elizabeth. It's at this point that Jane starts to neglect her studies and spends too much time on music. So Bullinger, a Protestant theologian, writes to her, and he impacts her hugely. She starts to model herself the same as Elizabeth, as a pious Protestant, and continues her life just quietly studying. But then, in 1551, her father is created Duke of Suffolk, and her family relocate to Sheen in London. But in April 1552 we start to see the demise of her cousin Edward, as he gets the measles and smallpox, but he does recover until a year later when he gets ill again. On the 25th of May that year, Jane marries Guildford Dudley after her father was convinced by the Earl of Northumberland, but her mother was not happy with the match. She expected a much more advantageous marriage for her daughter, if not to King Edward himself. The king was too ill to go to their wedding, sadly, but he did send wedding clothes and gifts. Jane also wasn't happy with the marriage, but she recognised her duty, and in fitting with the sorry affairs, lots of the guests got food poisoning. And now this is where the question of the line of succession comes in. So, Henry VIII's will said that his son Edward would, of course, succeed him. If he had no heirs, it would then go to Mary and then Elizabeth, even though both those daughters were illegitimate, supposedly. If Henry's children didn't have heirs, then the succession went to Henry's sister, Mary. Logically, it would then be her daughter, Frances, but Henry overlooked her, probably because he didn't like her husband, aka Jane's dad, so succession jumped from Mary to Jane, skipping out her parents. So her claim is set up already by her great-uncle Henry. It's just not really expected to get that far. When Edward gets ill again in the spring of 1553, he writes the plan for succession. He cuts out Mary because she's a Catholic and will undo all of his good work, so he has to cut out his other half-sister Elizabeth too, for the sake of fairness to his sisters, I presume. Instead, he says his succession should go to Jane's heir male, but he realises he's not going to live long enough for that to happen, so he adds the words to change the phrases, meaning the crown goes to Jane and her heirs male. So now the living king has laid out her path as well as the past king, and everyone supports his decision, so she should be recognised and accepted as queen by her council. And then on the 6th of July 1553, King Edward dies, unmarried and with no heir at the age of 15, and the officers of state sign his will naming Jane the successor. Jane is then taken to the home of Northumberland and is informed that she is the heir, and apparently she is distraught with the grief of the death of her cousin and the shock of this enormous role that's just been imposed upon her. I think you'd be shocked as well. But as we would guess, she's a strong-willed woman who's determined to make the best of the situation. She recognises her role and her duty, and she will continue Edward's good work. Now, she's not just a 9-day queen. Arguably, she's a 13-day queen. Big difference. She became queen on the 6th of July, the day Edward died, as she was written as his successor, just like Charles became our king the day Elizabeth died. Obviously, he wasn't coronated until later in May, but we still called him our king, so we should call Jane the queen. She was in the will as successor. But most people date her queenship from the 10th of July 1553, when she was publicly proclaimed queen, but she was just queen privately for 4 previous days. During those 13 days, she does mostly assert her authority, and she wasn't going to let herself be a puppet, as Northumberland expected her to be. He could not control her, and she refused his commands and would not make her husband king. That's right, your son's not going to be king, mate. Jane is queen. So, on the 10th of July, she arrives at the Tower of London, ready for her proclamation. When she arrives, she receives a letter from Mary saying she's not giving up her claim to the throne. Dun dun dun! So Jane issues a proclamation asking her people to rally behind her and support her claim. On the 18th of July, we have a letter written by her talking about her right to the throne that she has signed Jane Queen. Later, we have her signing for a delivery of jewels as Jane the Queen. But Queen has been scrubbed out as people quickly made clear they now didn't recognise her claim now that Mary is back in the picture. So maybe her reign was doomed from the start. Even though the king had laid out her path to succession, the people now want Mary. Even though Mary had nearly left the country before, thinking that she was going to be the one in trouble, as there's reports of the imperial ambassador urging Mary to leave the country, thinking the odds were against her and her situation was tenuous. But from the 10th of July, this changes and support for Mary grows instead. The ambassador even suggests it was all Northumberland's fault as well, like he had a big grand scheme to make his son king, for which Mary loathes him. So when she's queen, he's one to be punished by death. I mean, he did have a grand scheme to make his son king realistically, didn't he? He kept trying to force Jane to make him king. Anyway, Jane did have the more legitimate claim than Mary, as she was recognised by the council, but Edward's device wasn't even pushed through Parliament. Jane is now staying in the Tower of London as a prisoner until the 13th of November 1553, which is her trial that took place alongside her husband and Thomas Seymour's. It's quite a big turn of events for Jane. She thinks she's queen because she's got the support of the council, but Mary just rallies all the people behind her. She has all the Catholics and eventually a lot of earls as well. Anyway, Jane is now prisoner. Cranmer wrote her trial transcript in Latin, which tells us that she was just a teenage girl standing trial for treason. She walked the mile from the Tower to Guildhall, and she pleaded guilty, meaning she became the youngest royal woman to be condemned for treason. But the trial was just a formality, and Mary showed her intentions of showing mercy. It's not her fault she was written into the line of succession, and they are cousins. But of course, her story now takes another big turn. Mary wanted to pardon Jane. Mary was Francis's godmother. Jane grew up visiting Mary, and they had a close relationship, but ultimately Mary was forced, without really having a choice, because of these things. She knew Jane was forced into the situation, but recognised that justice was needed. Henry Grey, her father, the idiot, was a key conspirator in the Wyatt Rebellion that took up arms against Mary's intended marriage to the King of Spain, King Philip II of Spain, a suspicious Catholic foreigner who just wanted to get England involved in its wars. Now, Mary had previously already shown him mercy, releasing him from prison after Jane's deposition, so he had no second chance. Even though Jane obviously was not involved, the imperial ambassador demands her execution. So the decision of her execution comes as a huge shock to Jane, as Mary was just going to leave her be. Even though she was condemned, she could just live in the tower, carry on. But Jane decides she's going to die a Protestant martyr, even though Mary tries to save her soul by trying to convince her to convert to Catholicism. So on the 8th of February 1554, Mary sends a Catholic chaplain to convert her, but Jane debates with him, and he's so impressed by her determined spirit that he agrees to go with her on the execution day, so she need not be alone. It's now the 10th of February 1554. At 10 a.m, Jane watched her husband be taken to execution and watched his remains be brought back to the chapel. She reads from her prayer book whilst walking. She steps onto the scaffolding and says to the crowd, "Good people, I am come hither to die, and by a law I am condemned the same." She's very calm and composed, but then she's blindfolded. She realises the block isn't in reach and desperately panics and cries out, "Where is it? What do I do?" And it's this tragic, heartbreaking moment that we see in Paul Delaroche's art. Her hands are guided to the block and she puts her head down, and luckily one swing of the axe does it. Now sadly there's no portraits from the time that we know for definite are her, so we can't know for sure what she looked like. Even contemporary writing doesn't really tell us, and of course the most famous portrait of her execution by Paul Delaroche from 1833 doesn't show us what she looked like either. Not that it's important that we know what she looked like, but it's just a very big shame that there's no portraits of a queen, don't you think? She's worthy of being recognised for her academic abilities and strong spirit, and not just as a tragic victim of women's history. She's an accomplished intellect who didn't give in to the men surrounding her, like Northumberland just wanting his son to be king. And I think she deserves her place in our list of monarchs. So, shall we see how much you listened? 3 questions to end the episode. Who else did her tutor, and say that Jane was smarter than? It's of course Elizabeth I, another great queen who we can talk about in another episode if you want. Let me know on Instagram or something. Number 2. Who bought her wardship, recognising her importance as similar to Elizabeth and Mary? It is Thomas Seymour. And lastly, to end on a happy note, when was her execution? It was the 10th of February 1554. Well done if you got any of those. Thank you very much for listening, it means a lot. I hope you've enjoyed. Let me know. Share it on Instagram. I don't know what else you do. I will see you next time. Thanks for watching, I nearly said. Thanks for listening. Bye.